Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and I am reading you a short story from the series called Swamp Castle, titled Water Changes All Things. Life was never the same after the rescuers arrived. Their deaths changed everything about how the colony thought and how it acted. But these thoughts didn't mean much compared to the simple struggle some people made to survive. Then again, that was why the change in perspective meant so much to the people involved. The mirrors had taken 9 hours to set up, but it would be worth it. The cold sun slowly poured liquid life into the barrels below. It would mean the difference between riches or poverty for Kaber's family. It had taken the better part of 5 years to dig the second chamber. Their colony was the last. All of the others had died. Some had died from pointless wars. Some had died simply because they'd abandoned their efforts and joined the Mycroft colony. Kaber scooped another handful of dirt with his hands. With each scoop, he felt his heart beat faster. He had to be careful not to work too hard. It was easy to have trouble breathing. Air was always hard to come by. Water, even worse. They wouldn't kill you for wasting water, but they would make you work until you replaced 10 times the wasted weight. No one knew what had happened to Earth, and it had been 100 years since anyone had tried to find out. The telescope had broken a long time ago, and no one bothered with things like radios. At this point, it was all about survival. All of the secrets of the old technologies were buried in the archives, ready for the time when someone might try to unlock them. But the protocols demanded that each colony reach at least 20,000 strong before anyone bothered to attempt it. The earth was warm in his hands. You were supposed to try and get used to the cold at his age, but Kaber never had. He had just kept warming his hands with every spare moment he got, which wasn't many. He looked at the mirrors and smiled. The light was warm too, but it was never as warm as it should be. He stood up and walked out of the family garden to the Warren tunnels outside. Lillian was waiting for him, dressed in her tunic and skirt. She smiled. "Hi, Kaber. How you doing?" "Great. We've just got done with a few new mirrors. We should start being able to grow our own food." She beamed. "Cool. Good for you, Kaber." "More like good for my father." The head of the home cell owned everything in it, including his children. He didn't own Kaber's mother, of course, but since she owned the family's share in the commons, it balanced out. There was a reason most people chose to get married. Thus far, Kaber had 5 brothers and sisters. The number of children had put a real strain on things for a while, putting the family in debt, but that was going to change. Now they could start feeding themselves. "Have you asked anyone to the micro?" Lillian put her hands behind her head and blushed slightly. "No, I haven't exactly been in circulation for obvious reasons." "Would you go with me?" she asked hopefully. Kaber smiled, though he was careful not to laugh too loudly. "You can ask my father if you like." Lillian looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he's not likely to approve it." Kaber shook his head. Lillian was from Yomjob, who had spent a lot of their time on frippery. Most people from Mycroft were convinced this was why they had fallen. Mycroft wasn't foolish enough to turn away the potential for additional population, but they weren't about to restore social activity until the protocols allowed it. There were just no room for second chances, especially now. Lillian looked crestfallen. "Oh." She thought about it for a moment and smiled. "But if you could come, you'd like to, right?" Kaber smiled. "Yeah, sure." Lillian smiled with delight and ran away. No doubt that she had some elaborate plot to convince his father of her correct position. That wasn't going to happen. Kaber's grandfather had been on the protocol board, and there were appearances to be maintained. The Dursts were a good family brand, and Kaber's father intended to keep it that way. He had some time to kill. Technically speaking, he should be working on the family plot of land in the center of the house. Protocol demanded that every waking hour be spent doing something productive. There was recreation time, but even that was highly structured according to the perceived psychological requirements of the colony. It wasn't that they were obsessed with control for its own sake, but the leaders simply felt the intense responsibility for potentially being the last outpost of humanity, and the need to continue the species. For the most part, it worked. Mycroft hardly had any crime to speak of, and everyone did everything they could to make things better. Still, it was hard work, and by now some people were getting a little burned out by the whole thing. The wars had wasted a tremendous amount of resources, and the colony only had 15,455 people. There were a lot of people who felt that it was a sufficient amount to restore some of the elements of the old society, but the protocols had been worked out mathematically. There were only so many hours in a day, and to ensure the maximum possibility of survival, certain sacrifices had to be met. To ensure that everyone believed it, everyone was taught all aspects of the decisions to go into them. Those who chose not to work for the greater good of the colony were generally killed. It was harsh, but it had also kept Mycroft alive when most of the other softer colonies had long since died away or merged with Mycroft. They won their wars the same way they survived: pragmatic defense and strategic attrition. In the end, the numbers on Mycroft came out better than they did for anyone else, and the fact that Mycroft was still around was testament to its success. Kaber wanted to look at the periscope. People went to the surface under only the most dire of circumstances. Salvage missions were growing more infrequent, since most of the useful equipment had long since been stripped from the other colonies, and the defenses did not require much of an upgrade now that Mycroft was the only colony. In fact, it was only Mycroft's paranoia that kept them up at all, that and the possibility of rescue. The periscope was one of the oldest things in the colony. It was far older than the collapse back on Earth. Tradition held that whoever was the first to spot a ship was allowed to go with the greeting party outside. This effectively harnessed the eagerness of youth to keep vigilant watch over the city above. It was one of the reasons the council still encouraged it as a recreational activity. Constant vigilance was important. The unending red plain did not surprise him. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. The sun beat down on the lifeless rocks, though he was struck by the 2 Martian moons coming up over the horizon, over the mounds of dirt that the colony deposited from their digging efforts. It was easy to imagine a blue sky with green trees and air that you could breathe in limitless quantities when you looked out there. And then the ship landed. It didn't look like ships from the picture books. It was far blockier, and it was totally lacking in any kind of insignia except 2 giant red waves on the side. Kaber had no idea what it meant, but he knew what he was supposed to do. It had been drilled into him at an extremely young age. His hand went down to the alarm button, letting everyone know that the rocket had finally arrived. People only trickled in at first, but within 10 minutes the entire chamber was flooded to excess with people crowding around. The periscope chamber was one of the largest in the colony, and yet it probably couldn't hold a quarter of Mycroft's population. Mayor Fulbright came forward and asked him, "Kaber, did you see something?" Kaber was nervous. Everyone in the colony was watching him. He could tell from some of their expressions that they thought he was faking it. He ignored those people and replied to the mayor, "A ship! It landed!" The mayor's face instantly went from shock to joy to fear to grim determination within a few seconds. He looked at Kaber and nodded, "Good boy." Then he turned to the captain on his left and said, "Put a greeting party together. We need to find out who these people are and what they want. This may either be our salvation or our destruction. We need to find out which as quickly as possible." The captain nodded and began picking men and women from the crowd. Kaber knew most of them. The captain was making good choices, but then again, that was why he was captain. Kaber stammered a bit and then said, "Can I go too?" The captain looked at him for a moment as if he were insane, but then frowned. "Yeah, I'd forgotten about that stupid rule." He looked at the mayor, who shook his head. The captain sighed and said, "Fine, follow us." The suit was very old. Rumor had it that the entire thing had been patched over 3 or 4 times, but there were a few parts that were not replaceable. There had originally been over 24 suits, and now there were only 5. They were meticulously cared for, but the environment outside was quite harsh. The elevator ride up to the top was also exhilarating and terrifying. Since Mycroft couldn't spare the power, the entire thing had to be moved by hand, but that left a jerking and uneven ride as they felt 24 people help them move over 100 feet up in less than a minute. The steel cable looked rusty, though they had all checked it at least twice. Mycroft could not afford to lose any people. When they reached the airlock, Caber couldn't help but take a deeper breath. It was a waste of oxygen, but he was about to enter the outside for the first time in his life. He'd seen it through the periscope numerous times, but this was something else entirely. They waited a good 10 minutes as the oxygen inside the airlock was painstakingly pulled back into Mycroft. Nothing was wasted. When they went outside, Caber looked up. They told him not to do this, and now he knew why. It was at this point that the knowledge that there was nothing but gravity keeping him from flying out into the void of space forever became truly real. The sun was setting, and the stars were out. They were beautiful, but they were terrifying. It was so vast, so open, and so free that it took his breath away. A firm grip and a shout from the captain brought him back to reality. "Stop that!" Caber looked up and was confused for a moment. Then he got his bearings and said, "Sorry. It happens to everyone, but we can't afford that kind of thing right now. Just keep quiet and keep your head down." Enox, the communications expert the captain had chosen, said, "Sir, I'm not getting anything on the radio." "Right. Keep your guns handy. We have no idea who these guys are." The captain slowly moved forward. He motioned for Caber to stay put while he went with Enox to the right, and the other two members of their party branched off to the left. They were obviously wearing armor over their spacesuits. That was a bad sign. They both looked at the captain for a moment and drew a pair of guns. Before they could get off a single shot, the rest of the landing party opened fire and shot at the rescuers. Caber's first thought was that he wanted a gun. His second thought was how horrible this was. Caber hadn't even noticed that the landing party had firearms of their own. One or two of the men was clearly dead, and the other was writhing in pain on the ground while air leaked out of his suit. Caber knew that throwing up inside his suit was bad. He didn't remember why, but it was. He bent over, though. He'd never seen blood like that. He'd never seen a wound like that, and he certainly had never seen violence like this. Mercifully, just as he was about to lose his struggle to keep from throwing up, he felt a blow to the back of his head, knocking him out. His final thought before he blacked out was wondering if he could throw up while you slept. He woke up in the medical ward right next to the wounded rescuer. The other man was unconscious and on a breather. The physician stood across from him in his ceremonial lab coat and did not look pleased. "Who are they?" he asked. The captain shook his head. "I don't know. They don't seem to speak English, that much is certain." "They're probably military," the physician said, "or at least trained as soldiers. Look at the musculature. They also have several scars, though I don't recognize the patterns." The mayor's question was more specific. "Can you save him?" The physician shook his head. "I give him 24 hours to live at best, probably less, more like 5. The captain sighed. "In other words, not enough time to learn English." All three of them looked at each other in uncomfortable silence. Finally, the physician noticed that Caber was awake. He walked around the small table and spoke. "You're awake. Good. We were worried for a while. The captain knocked you unconscious to keep you from throwing up. Probably saved your life." The physician smiled. Caber couldn't tell if he was joking or not. He continued, He also saved you from the wrath of the engineer. She isn't happy with people who mess up her suits." Caber nodded. That wasn't a prospect he would have looked forward to. He looked at the physician and asked, "Why would they send people here when they can't speak English?" The mayor walked away from the curtain and said, "Who knows? Maybe in whatever disaster caused Earth to lose contact made them lose records of which colony spoke which language." The captain did not bother to walk around the curtain. He just drew it back in his right hand. He drew it back with his right hand, but continued looking at the rescuer. The mayor looked at him. "What is it?" "You know, they might have been looking for another colony and found them all inactive. Since we had our beacon up, they could have come here instead." The captain tapped his nose and thought. Caber said, "Well, does anyone from one of the other colonies speak any other languages?" No one from Mycroft spoke anything but English, of course. The dead languages were but they weren't required by protocol, so in the database they waited until the population got to be high enough. The mayor looked at Caber and said, "You're right. We should find out." The captain patted Caber's back as if to say, "Wow, you were actually useful for something after all," or perhaps the more polite, "Good job, son." But either way, he didn't actually say anything. Within 30 minutes, everyone in the colony had been thoroughly vetted. Communication was very fast and efficient. The only thing that had slowed them down had been the time it had taken to physically walk the distance to find everyone in their designated notification partner. It had to be done that way. The colony's intercom system hadn't worked in years. There were a few who spoke German, Spanish, Chinese, and one person who spoke Japanese, albeit badly. All were paraded before the rescuer. He seemed to respond somewhat to German, making a few inquiries, but neither understood each other. Finally, once the mayor relented to allowing one of the precious picture books to be taken from the vault to get the man to the point. The rescuer pointed to pictures of Earth and himself. He pointed to pictures of Europe, but he appeared to be from the nation of Czechoslovakia. When they showed him pictures of mushroom clouds, he was uncomprehending. He definitely understood about rocket ships, and they said something when they pointed to a space station, but they didn't get much from it. When they pointed to animals and plants from Earth, he seemed to recognize them at least, although he got very excited when they pointed to a cat and a dog. Did that mean he owned them back on Earth, or that they were all dead back on Earth and that he loved them and wanted to talk about them? He didn't understand English at all, and from every attempt to get more out of him, he met stubbornly with negative answers. Apparently, he understood no. In fact, it wasn't until Kaber called him an ignorant fool under his breath that he realized that the man could speak English. He simply refused to do so. He immediately conveyed this information to the captain. Well, that makes a lot more sense. There are too many holes in his story otherwise, but he's too weak to try and squeeze more information out of him. We just have to wait and see if we can find more information on the ship. The ship contained a few photographs and several symbols no one recognized. They had a lot of guns, though, so whatever their intent was, everyone was pretty sure it was hostile. What had they hoped to accomplish? Two men certainly weren't going to conquer the world by themselves. If they could understand English, then they had heard Mycroft's beacon, and they knew that they were still alive. No one knew, for he died 2 days later. Kaber had not initially been planning on going to the Micro, but his view on the outside had stirred something up inside him that he'd never known he had. He had to be something more than a productive member of society rigidly following the protocols. There had to be something more to life, even if it meant taking a slight chance that the colony was going to fail. He felt bad because he didn't ask his father, and the penalties for that could be severe. But it turned out that he didn't have to worry. His father was there, along with the rest of the family. At first, Kaber thought his father was going to yell at him, but the man only smiled. Kaber didn't understand. He walked through the micro-dancers and asked, "Father, what brings you here?" He couldn't think of a better way to ask the question, and it certainly was better than, "Am I in trouble somehow?" His father smiled and smoothed his beard. "Well, lots of reasons. Officially, we're here because the rumor is that the council is going to announce some major changes here, not just for the protocols, but to the mission statement itself. But the truth of the matter is, we're really here to celebrate." Kaber scratched his head. He didn't understand. "What do you mean, celebrate?" "We're no longer responsible for keeping the human race alive, just us. Oh, some of the hardliners are posting theories that these two might have been the head of an invasion or that they were the last humans on Earth. But no one really believes them. Oh, they probably meant no good at all, but they were almost certainly not the last." "But why does that mean anything?" "Because it does, son. Leave it at that." Kaber didn't want to leave it at that, but he wasn't going to stir things up if he was told not to do so. Even if they changed the mission statement to, "Let's do everything Kaber says," he would never speak to his father that way. The microdance had actually been developed well before the colony had lost contact with Earth. It had been a way to take advantage of Mars's lower gravity and conserve oxygen, but that had become a method of showing how much skill one could do in a single environment. Now people were doing the exact opposite, leaping up and down in great bounds. A lot of other folk looked upset, but no one bothered to mention it to them. It was a party. It was a release. And finally, Kaber had joined in with Wild Abandon himself. Someone from the other colonies was passing out a drink called whiskey, which tasted funny but helped him jump higher when he did jump. He found Lillian and kissed her. It was the nicest kiss in his entire life. The party was mostly a blur after that. He vaguely recalled a great council meeting in which the colony decided to include quality of life in the defense of Mars on its priority list. He couldn't remember the details, but he did know that the biggest argument was about whether or not restarting the other colonies was a good idea. For the most part, people agreed that it was. But the biggest change for him involved waking up with Lillian in his room. He didn't understand the headache, but as painful as it was, he knew that it was nothing compared to the pain his father was going to give him if he didn't get him out of his room as quickly as possible. "What happened last night?" She giggled. "You don't remember?" Kaber shook his head. "No, I don't." "We didn't get married, did we?" Lillian looked shocked. "Why, is that a proposal?" Kaber stammered. "We're too young." "No, we're not." She moved closer. Kaber took a step back. "Right. There's also the matter of permission. That's what you missed last night. The mayor's changed everything. They've abolished the protocol." Kaber was shocked. Protocol had dictated his whole life. Protocol was the thing that kept them all together. It kept things going. It was the closest thing to religion that Mycroft had ever really permitted. It might be easier for Lillian to accept, but he wasn't sure what to do himself. Just like that? Not just like that. There was a hell of an argument, but in the end, they listened to the mayor. Things have to change, and so they're going to go back to the way things were. But things aren't the way... Kaber shut up when she interrupted him. They were, yes. That's what they said last night. Look, the Earth is there. People are alive. They might come back. They might not. But we have to evolve. We have to become something better, and that means we can't live our whole lives with everything dictating everything we do. Kaber sat down and sighed. What was the point of arguing about it? Lillian sat next to him and asked, so what do you think? About what? What do you think about what? She frowned. Us, stupid. Well, I still think marriage is too soon, Kaber said very carefully. I mean, I don't know a lot about the old ways. Lillian giggled again. It's called dating, stupid. We get to know each other more. Really get to know each other. Kaber thought about it. I'd like that. So, I mean, it's obvious from this that I was learning. I've learned from previous mistakes. The writing's better, the characters are better, the setting is better. But if it's not an A, it's not going to get out of a slush pile. And I can't qualify this as a B+. I'll give it a B. Definitely not a B-, but a solid B. What worked? Kaber is a character that you can actually follow and relate to. He has an arc. He does things that affect the story. At the end of the day, this story is more of a Maloo story, where I always wondered, Mars is such a harsh environment, and people fuck things up all the time. And civilizations can collapse. And I deliberately kept the nature of the intruders ambiguous. These are the strangers who come in, and they're not defined. They exist in the story as agents of societal change, and so I don't need to define them. But I give them a few details, like they're from Czechoslovakia and they had a lot of guns. I'll admit, I don't know the answer to that. I can speculate, given this. But either way, I think that I did the right thing, keeping them largely irrelevant to the story. Basically, this story is pretty solid in terms of the way it should be written. If I was to rewrite it, I'd probably include more details. I'd make it shorter. Slice of life in a really grim environment like this is just... I mean, I'm sure there's a market for it, but generally speaking, while it's not required, you should write what you like to read. And I mean, if I was to read an anthology and look for an anthology, harsh survival stories and hardcore sci-fi is not typically the thing I most write. But, at the time when I was interested in selling these stories, the market was definitely for that. There was a much larger market for hard sci-fi. I believe that's changed since then. I haven't tried to sell a story in about 10 years, but from the 50,000 foot level, it looks like there's a lot more room for fantasy, soft science, et cetera, which I tend to be much better at writing than I do at this. None of the science is ridiculous. It basically works. It's neither good nor bad. I hope you enjoyed it.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!